If you've spent any amount of time on the internet over the past few years, you've probably heard it. Maybe it was the booming, overblown bass. Maybe it was the vocals that were pitch shifted to the point where they sounded less like a human's voice and more like a wailing screech. Maybe it was the visual aesthetic with bright neon colors bombarding your screen to an almost nauseating degree. Maybe it was lyrics calling you a piss baby and making fun of how small your arms are. What you heard would likely be described by many as hyperpop, and it's led those same people to ask a question. Is hyperpop the future of pop? Maybe. Before we talk about that, let's talk about where hyperpop came from and what it even is. Hyperpop can first be traced back to the mid-2000s, with the halcyon days of the internet and the rise of nightcore. Nightcore as a genre revolved around increasing both the pitch and tempo of a pre-existing song, and also anime. But around the turn of the decade, we began seeing the first artists that could reasonably be called hyperpop's ancestors. Grimes could be considered a forebearer of hyperpop with her 2012 album Oblivion. Electropop acts of the time too, like 303, Brief Carolina, Kesha even, if you want to take it that far. You could even point to, I can't believe I'm about to bring out this album again, Farrah Abraham's My Teenage Dream Ended. You know, there's three kinds of people in this world. Fans of Farrah Abraham, people who can finish lists. What is hyperpop? What is hyperpop? Well, to quote US Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, I know it when I see it. The two most present musical qualities of hyperpop would have to be A, blaring bass to the point of distortion, and B, high-pitched vocals to the point of parody. On their own, these two qualities can be found in many other genres, but when they're put together, they create this harsh sparseness in the mix. You feel like what you're listening to is less a properly mixed song and more like musical elements that are caged off on the frequency spectrum. There are other qualities that are often associated with hyperpop: artificial sounding, almost metallic synths and percussion, lyrics that hang on a balance between deeply personal and deeply ironic, an incurable sense of being extremely online TMCR. But I want to keep my definition confined to those two for reasons that'll hopefully become clear by the end of this. So now let's take an abridged tour through hyperpop in the last decade and highlight some of its most representative releases. Hyperpop's first real torchbearers were born in 2013 as personal computer music, or PC music. The group was started in London by producer A.G. Cook, with tracks being uploaded to SoundCloud at a rapid, almost inhuman pace. A year later, the collective had over 40 tracks on their page, and artists like Cook, Danny L. Harl, Hannah Diamond, Girlfriend of the Year, and Kanye West had inspired a fervent online following. Many of these initial tracks were later compiled into an album, PC Music Volume 1. The most essential track on here is A.G. Cook's Beautiful. I'm a bit biased since this was the first PC music track I ever heard, but it perfectly encapsulates the musical traits I mentioned earlier. Each element of the mix, while not necessarily strange on their own, is pushed to its logical extreme. Altogether, it toes the line between sincerity and parody. Speaking of which, once PC music started getting more attention, that balancing act became one of the biggest focal points in the press they received. Most of the artists in the collective would push back on the idea that what they were doing was satire, and I would agree, but it's not like that idea wasn't unfounded. Here's an example: Hey Cutie by QT, one of the collective's first paid tracks. Now QT isn't real. This track was made by Cook and PC affiliate Sophie, who I'll touch on later, and the woman in the video is artist Hayden Dunham. The woman is also the embodiment of the fictional energy drink called QT, but even though QT isn't a real person, they still performed this song live. One of the performances was at a Red Bull event, which is where they were promoting QT, the energy drink, which was apparently real now. What is going on? But despite some of their antics, I believe Cook & Co. when they say that what they were doing was earnest. Maybe this is optimistic of me to say, but you don't write music like this and accrue a fan base like theirs by just being ironic. PC music had distilled pop music down to its bare necessities so effectively and transparently that many could think it was a joke. And they'd probably say things like, "Oh yeah, if you guys think pop is so great, why haven't you made a pop 2?" It's worth briefly remembering where British pop star Charli XCX was in the mid-2010s. She had 2 albums under her belt, and her biggest hit was a feature on Iggy Azalea's Fancy. But after 2014's Sucker, a solo hit with Boom Clap, and meeting up with the PC Music crew, Charli decided to branch out into more experimental electronic territory. The first steps were the Vroom Vroom EP, executive produced by Sophie, and the #1 Angel mixtape, executive produced by A.G. Cook. The culmination of her dabbling with PC music was 2017's Pop 2. If you want a blueprint for hyperpop, Pop 2 is it. The combination of Charli's knack for songwriting and Cook's refined production made for the most potent display of hyperpop's potential yet, not just in their chemistry as musicians, but also in the number of artists who pop up here who would go on to represent the genre, like Dorian Electra, Caroline Polachek, and Kim Petras. Certain songs on here might not click on first listen, but it'd be hard to deny the sublime hooks of Backseat, Delicious, and Track 10, which would eventually be remade as Blame It On Your Love. What I'm trying to say is, if someone swapped out the US Constitution with Pop 2, no one would notice. After being involved with the genre for just about the whole decade, producer Sophie released her debut album in 2018, Oil of Every Pearl's Insides. Why do I feel gross after saying that? Even though I've waited to bring her up until now, please don't think she is a minor player in the genre. Tracks like Bip, Nothing More to Say, and the compilation album Product were just as instrumental in securing hyperpop's place in music as PC Music and Charli. Oil, however, was arguably her grand coronation as a defining producer in this space. Whereas A.G. Cook's production was fairly inviting once you got over the initial acclamation, Sophie's production was and still feels brazen and uncompromised. Plus, her work often feels like a critique of consumerism and capitalism, like on Face Shopping. But once you get onto her level, you're rewarded with some of the genre's best tracks, like It's Okay to Cry and Immaterial. Oil of Every Pearl's Insides represented a breakthrough for Sophie and for hyperpop as a whole. Not only was she nominated for a Grammy, but up to this point she had also been producing for Madonna, Flume, and even Vince Staples. I've heard what heaven sounds like, and it's Vince and Kendrick Lamar rapping over Sophie beats. Plus, her music was being used in commercials like an Adidas ad featuring Beyonce, and even one for McDonald's. Take that, Travis Scott. So now we reach the final album on this mini tour, and just like everyone's favorite amphibian platforming mascot from the 90s, it's Gecs.
Hey, you little piss baby, you think you're so
100 Gecs is
weirder than 4th of July at Rick James' place.
Dylan Brady and Laura Les combined their respective forces in the latter half of the 2010s and released their debut album in 2019, 1000 Gecs. That name comes from the fact that there are 10 tracks of 100 Gecs equaling 1000 Gecs. It's basic math. I've described hyperpop thus far as pop taken to its logical extreme, but 100 Gecs is hyperpop itself taken to its logical extreme. The bass has gone from simply overblown to consuming the entire mix. The vocals have gone from basic pitch shifting to warbled shrieks. It is at best artful noise, and at worst, noise. And yet, it is still pop. Take Stupid Horse off 1000 Gecs, for example. It has a common pop song chord progression and a clear melody. If you swapped out the overall timbre with a folk punk band, it would be a pretty killer pop song. Oh wait, that already exists? If you were to transcribe these songs on sheet paper, there wouldn't be much groundbreaking here. Instead, this music gains its power from its sound quality. And when it works, there are very few things as cathartic as feeling so clean like a money machine. And many artists have taken note of that catharsis, as evidenced by this year's remix album 1000 Gecs and the Tree of Clues. The album features Charli XCX, Rico Nasty, Injury Reserve, even Fall Out Boy singing over what looks to be Ratatouille 2. Ratatouille. The rise of the Gec prompted what may go down as one of hyperpop's defining texts. This tweet from Jabuki Young White. 100 Gecs is for early Gen Z, late millennials. You have to be zooted off pixie sticks running around a crazy frog on blue dabba dee dabba die with an undiagnosed behavioral learning disorder at a mid-2000s birthday party to fully comprehend. Me and my 3 children are deeply hurt. But even though 100 Gecs are one of the most polarizing groups in music currently, they've also helped inspire the new wave. While I enjoy, or at least respect, all of the artists I've mentioned so far, what gets me most excited about about hyperpop's viability is this new upspring of musicians who are taking what the old guard have done and running wild with it. Many of them can be found on Spotify's Hyperpop playlist, which has been held up as a major way for artists to break through in the genre and even potentially make a living. And part of that running wild means hyperpop is even more difficult to narrow down than it was before. Hyperpop is now a genre that encompasses everything from Caroline Polachek's more straightforward pop, to the extravagant club bounce of Slater and Dorian Electra, to the emo rap bops by Osquin, Black Winter Wells, and Glaive, to nu metal influenced stuff like Rina Sawayama, to the alt-rock of Haro Carabinito, who happen to have Kanye West from earlier in the band, or the vaporwave shoegaze of George Clanton, or the chiptune rock of Anna Monoguchi, or what is basically cloud rap by Echo 2K and Blade. But then you start thinking, do these genre barriers even exist? What if hyperpop's been around for decades and no one ever noticed? Was Fancy by Iggy Azalea hyperpop? Was I'm Blue by Eiffel 65 hyperpop? What about Britney Spears? What about Prince? Look at how that man dressed in the 90s. Has all pop been hyperpop? What do hyper and pop even mean? Do these genres even exist? Does the idea of musical genre even exist? Do I even exist? And at this point, when Slater's Daddy AF is causing you to have an existential crisis, you realize you gotta back it up a bit. Look, trying to narrow down hyperpop is a fruitless, maddening, pointless endeavor, in large part because the genre is still growing into itself. There's a fairly good chance that this video will be outdated within a year from now, if not a few months. But that fluidity has allowed hyperpop to be incredibly inclusive, not just to different sounds, but also to people of different backgrounds and genders, specifically transgender and non-binary artists. It's also allowed artists in this space, who often make music in their homes with their own personal gear, to adapt easily to the world around them. I don't think it's a coincidence that the first major quarantine album was made by hyperpop's most high-profile star. If there's one record I would recommend you check out from this wave, I'd say it's the recent self-titled record from Food House.
Books!
I can't say I like all of it, but it is absolutely wild. It also has one of the funniest lines I've heard all year.
Could a Target CVS tonight? It is the only time I feel alive.
From my limited time exploring, this whole new wave has an energy and creative hustle that I haven't seen on the internet in ages. It's like early YouTube, you know what I mean? That time period when the things that would go viral felt DIY and human, things that anyone with a camera and internet access could make, like in this Food House music video.
It doesn't need to be 3D or 2D.
That's Helvetica 72-point font at 100% scale, and I know that because it's the default text setting when you drop a custom text block into Final Cut Pro. It's that energy and playful experimentation that I think is why so many people consider hyperpop to be the future of pop. But let's go a little bit deeper. Let's lay out some potential courses for hyperpop to go from here. One, it goes nowhere. The genre stays in its niche corner of the internet with its passionate audience, and within the next few years, it dies out or morphs into some new iteration or other genre entirely. Two, someone who's already established in the pop sphere gets into hyperpop, brings on someone from the scene to produce, and the genre gets a proper spotlight on it. Maybe Charlie gets a big hit with AG or Sophie producing, or we get a sort of Taylor Swift folklore situation where some prominent artist all of a sudden releases a full album produced by someone in the hyperpop sphere. It would have to be someone who already is comfortable making music that involves heavy emphasis on bass as well as lighter vocals that float above the mix. Or I don't know, maybe Ariana Grande drops an album produced by 100 Gecs, I don't know. Three, the genre has a fluke Old Town Road-esque pop hit, a song that through word-of-mouth buzz and probably TikTok memes becomes the sound of a future summer, albeit a sound that leads people to decry the current state of popular music. Whoever makes that song will go on to have crossover appeal, but the genre of hyperpop as a whole will stay relegated to the internet. Four, and this is the one I'd be most interested to see happen, the genre experiences a slow burn of rising popularity. Those who are at the genre's forefront, Charlie, Sophie, AG, continue their progressions, but this other, younger, rapidly shifting section continues experimenting and tinkering and figuring out what the heck this new sound even is. It certainly won't hurt that hyperpop works very well with trap and cloud rap, which opens up even more possibilities. And over the course of the next decade, these two genres merge to create something new and even less defined. Who who knows, maybe over time, what we consider the sound of pop becomes a relic of music history or even relegated to academia. Can you imagine music students 50 years from now analyzing Britney Spears in their classes? I think hyperpop gets us a bit closer to that reality in whatever form it may take. To be clear, I can't say for sure which of these outcomes will happen, if any of them end up happening. There is still so much potential for this genre and so many different places it could go, and while that kind of fluidity doesn't make for definitive statements, it does make me excited for the future of pop, what it'll sound like, and most importantly, the musicians behind it.
All the money in my